Hello, welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management. Why don't you guys introduce yourselves and just we'll get started.
Sure. So I'm Tianon Gravi with InfoSiftr. Been with InfoSiftr since, 2010. We do container consulting, training. Basically, we run the gamut in the container community.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And I'm Noah Abrahams. I'm also with InfoSiftr, the VP of Enablement and a CNCF ambassador.
Yes, and I'm thinking of dim sum right now.
Oh, dumplings ahoy.
Dumplings ahoy. Yeah, we had some good food in Shanghai.
Boy, did we.
Yeah. And so, but we're here now on the spring circuit, and we're here at DockerCon. And the topic that we're really interested in is security, but we're going to do more reporting on the Linux kernel, right? And the Linux kernel development.
Yeah, sure.
And starting to understand more like how, how the kernel is being used and what are the responsibilities, of the cloud service providers and for the developers, and the ones who are all using, essentially Linux, right? Built upon LXC, now, Docker. And, in the past few days, we've been thinking a lot about how does something so standard as Docker become so pivotal in terms of how you think about continuous integration, continuous delivery, not just from a technical point of view, but now from like a security point of view. So developer security is seeming to be a much more relevant topic, but I'm curious from your guys talking to customers, how much do they understand, and how do you, what do you takeaways you get from the community, coming out of an attack like we saw on Docker earlier in the week?
Well, I think one of the first things I'd like to break down is where security fits within the ecosystem and the spectrum of security and how it gets implemented. And most of the security functions that we see out there tend to fall into this sort of passive versus active versus forensic spectrum. That's how I like to break it down anyway. But one of the problems that we see in a lot of places is how people approach a particular topic and wanting to put it into a singular bucket. So to take something like Docker Hub and say, oh, well, that's based on provenance, it's based on how the images are stored, so that's going to be more passive. I'm not going to think about that in terms of an active security. I'm going to think about that in terms of something that's already been done, and I'm not going to mentally treat that with all of the respect that it deserves because it needs to be held within multiple buckets.
Right.
Yeah, and then from the perspective of the customers that we've talked to, I think the container ecosystem in general is just starting to really hit the mainstream hard. Mm-hmm. It's been growing significantly, but it hasn't been a mainstream technology until fairly recently. And I think the success of Docker and of Kubernetes has helped drive that, and the ease with which it's made deploying containers, and that's also been kind of a problem for security, right?
Deploying.
Because now we've enabled anyone to use this. We've made it so simple for people to deploy code that now they're deploying code, which is awesome. But I think we need more education, more talking about the security aspects of that, especially around the runtime security of containers. That's one place where I see problems a lot, where people just don't quite understand that a container is still a process.
Yeah.
And some of the security lessons that we've learned in the past still apply just as readily today. They're still actively applicable. Like the compromise on Docker Hub, that's not an unusual compromise for a service like that. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we need to be planning for. To Noah's point, we need to be thinking about what happens when this service gets compromised, and how do I rotate my credentials? How do I handle that compromise? How do I detect that compromise? How do I work forward from that?
And how do you even be more preventative? For example, you two are both accomplished, technologists in this space, and you well know the dangers of unverified images, right? So Docker Hub is, that's what it is essentially, except for the Docker's official images that are assigned.
Yeah, I think there are ways to mitigate that at runtime, for example, like referring to images by their content addressable digest is great, but it's not something that I think is well known and well understood by the community. That when you reference an image by digest, you're getting a cryptographic hash of that image, and Docker will verify the contents before it says, yep, that image that I pulled is the one that I expected to pull. So using that would go a long ways towards helping mitigate this type of attack. Because then
what would that involve?
So that means that when you push a tag like, say, my corporation / Acme, whatever product, latest, when I push that tag, Docker gives me back a digest.
Right.
And that digest is a cryptographic hash of the image contents.
Right.
Which I can then use instead of saying latest, I can say at that cryptographic hash.
Right.
And then when I pull the image, I know that I got exactly the same bits that I pushed.
Right. That's that password. That's the hash. That's the capability
and
of hash.
if the image that I get back doesn't match that hash, Docker will reject it, which I think is a powerful security tool. One of many that people need to use. There's more aspects to security than just securing that one piece, obviously, but
now we've reached another level of there's a new dimension to this now, because now if the if the access keys are taken, there's a larger issue there.
I think the thing I haven't seen stressed quite enough on the Docker attack last week is that it involves GitHub tokens.
Yeah.
And if something goes wrong there, it goes wrong in a really bad way.
Yeah.
Because GitHub is where your source code is. It's most people's central source of truth, right?
Right.
Or at least version control in general.
Right.
And so if you're storing your code in GitHub and that token is compromised, your source code is compromised.
Yeah, because it'll be declaratively updating the code.
Yeah.
It'll be doing the continual delivery.
And
now
it could, with one of those tokens, you could modify the settings of a GitHub repository to add a new deploy token that no one's going to notice for months if they're not actively auditing their access.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's really important for people to understand that, and to understand that this is a big deal, and this is something that they need to go and actively double check that they've rotated their tokens and that they've updated their password, and plan for this kind of problem in the future.
Now, with the cloud service providers like GitHub, for example, or GitLab, or Elastic and Bitbucket, what are their responsibilities? When you're passing tokens between Docker Hub and GitHub, it's doing it through OAuth, right? And OAuth is, now it's OAuth 2.0, correct? It's like, and that seems to be another kind of added dimension that's going to have to be considered as continuous delivery becomes more predominant too. There has to be some responsibility on the cloud service providers as well.
Personally, I think that some of the responsibility should be in terms of what does it look like for the business that's consuming that particular service. So as it was pointed out, when we realized that the GitHub tokens were going to be one of the primary vectors involved in this particular hack, I said to myself, well, luckily it's Git, because if somebody goes in and changes some code, well, Git can roll back.
Right.
And I think that's going to be what a lot of people are going to look for. They're going to go in and say, did my code change? No, I'm probably unaffected. And then you look at the things that he just brought up. Said, what else could they have done? Because GitHub is not just a Git repository, it's a much more comprehensive service providing these other capabilities to the end user. They need to look at how the business consumer is actually looking at this particular service and how they're using it, and they need to be able to provide some sort of, hey, you just updated a different type of token that you've never used before. Maybe you want to look at that. I think that's something that really needs to be their responsibility.
It comes back down to that base image, doesn't it? In terms of how, I mean, this is where this seems to where it gets very quite nuanced, right? Because if, what are you actually getting from, if you're going into Docker Hub and you're using a base image that perhaps might have been in a database that had been compromised, and that a malicious image had now been placed back in there, and then that could then be the base image then for your application build, right? How do you think about sorting issues like that out? I mean, it's very existential, but there's often this very much pass the buck when it comes back down to that base image itself.
I think the SHA hash is really the only major mitigating circumstance that you can look at right now,
right?
Because labels are mutable. I mean, there's nothing that prevents me from taking, let's say, an CentOS image and relabeling as an Ubuntu. There's nothing that prevents me from doing that. Similarly, there's nothing that prevents me from labeling arbitrarily malicious code as this particular base image that exists within somebody's particular repo. There's really nothing that stops that because it's inherent to the concept of labeling within the Docker environment.
I think for me, one thing that could help with this problem, and something I do for my own personal use, is anytime I find an image that I think is interesting and I want to use for something, like say I wanted to say I just bought a new router. I got one of those fancy Unify routers or Ubiquity. Ubiquity is the one I'm thinking of, where you've got a controller that you need to run, and they provide that as a Docker container. One thing that I like to do is look for the source, so that I can find the actual Docker file that built that container, so that I can reproduce it myself, and verify it. Not just verify their image, but even if it's really important to me, take over the maintenance of it, because then I can control when it updates, and I can constantly be vetting it and kind of take an active responsibility in the life cycle of that image, which doesn't scale very well for a large organization, but I think it's a good step for at least having some method of verifying that image. You can go and build it locally and then use a tool like Dive to go and look into the image and see, does this roughly match what they pushed? Can I roughly trust this? And if you do that periodically, then you can help spot checks and or changes. And that's something that you could implement in like a CICD workflow to have it automatically rebuilding your dependencies and verifying that they didn't change, or just rebuilding it yourself every time and monitoring the source instead.
So when you're thinking about the ongoing evolution of continuous delivery, and you're thinking about the ongoing evolution of ways that developers are building application architectures, how important does open source become in this? Because for historically, security companies have really dominated, and they've been able to really use it as as a weapon, using it as a way to kind of sow, fear and uncertainty and doubt, right? The FUD issue. So, so how does open source security kind of play in that? Because it doesn't seem as well evolved as you might think.
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for just the ability to have that open viewpoint on any sort of code that's been checked in, to be able to have anyone potentially look at the code that's there. How do I want to phrase that? Without having that openness, you're losing out on a significant percentage of potential PRs, potential fixes that could go for any security patch. And by having access to the code, then you're giving access to people to potentially fix that code.
Yeah. Right.
And I think we forget sometimes that, not all the hackers that are out there are black hats.
Right.
There's plenty of white hats out there in the world that go to look for vulnerabilities and say, hey, I found something for you. Let me go help you fix that.
Right.
Anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I think open source is absolutely critical to security in the future. If you take a look at, for example, Kubernetes. Kubernetes is a project that started at Google, right? And Google was driving it initially. But today, I don't think it's fair to say that Google is still driving Kubernetes. I think it's a team effort, and it's improving infrastructure for everyone. The old saying, rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah, this does it.
I think that same methodology has to apply to security. If we keep that behind closed doors, then I think we're hampering ourselves as a community.
So what is the posture that you're looking, that you would want to look for from the cloud security companies who are, or container security companies who, a lot of them come from the security business, and so you can still see that kind of that positioning that it has this historical context to it.
Well, I think that goes back to my earlier point about the spectrum and where they fit within them. If you look down on the floor, downstairs, there's half a dozen security companies that are out on the floor, and they all take different pieces and different aspects. Some of them are focusing more on the forensics of what happened after the fact. Some of them are focusing on provenance. But for the most part, what I see from the security companies are that they're going to be focusing on what's happening now, more of almost an evolution from the historical intrusion detection systems, to say, okay, can we figure out what's happening in the network? Can we figure out what's happening in my microservices? Can we figure out what's happening with any of the containers that are happening distributed throughout my entire Kubernetes environment? And a lot of what I've seen in the field is the security companies tend to be landing in one area of that and then expanding out across the spectrum to say, hey, if we're focused on runtime, that's not enough. We need to be able to focus also on provenance. We need to be able to focus on image history. We need to be able to focus potentially on forensics. We need to be able to focus throughout the area. Do we have history? Do we have the ability to proactively guess what might be happening in the environment and prevent attacks? And I think that's where a lot of the security companies are going to all eventually converge in having a strength in one particular area and then being able to expand out to the others.
So I've been, last couple of years, I've been going to the B-Sides LV security conference. It's a smaller, more grassroots security conference for security professionals. And one thing I really like about that conference is that it's more of the community type folks who want to push this kind of thing.
Who do you see there? Who are the people that come to a conference like that?
People like Hacks for Pancakes, Leslie, what's her last name? Carhart. People like Johnny Xmas. There's a number of folks who are very prolific on Twitter who frequent those type of conferences. And I think that the work they're doing there is very valuable and important to push this forward. But back on security companies who don't necessarily attend those conferences and don't subscribe to the same community-focused ideals, I think it's going to be important for the same thing that motivates them to do other things. Their customers calling and saying, we want this. We want you to do this. Nothing motivates a company faster than a lot of their customers saying, hey, we want you to do this. And if they get enough customers, eventually they'd be stupid to ignore them. And I think it's in the customer's best interest to call up their security vendors and say, hey, what are you guys doing in open source? How are you pushing the community forward? How are you making all of us better? Not just you guys or my company, but all of us, everyone.
That's a different posture. What do you think is required then of the major platform providers, I would argue Docker is one. I mean, they have a Docker hub that is vastly popular, but they made a conscious decision from the start to make it, freely available to upload your images and download your images. And it's basically, I mean, it was described to me recently as S3 with an index, really. And
the good UI.
Yeah, with a good UI.
It's a good way to put it.
And so what should the rest of the community be asking of the providers like Docker? What should they be demanding of them? Instead of just saying, check your creds, which developers should do, and that's their responsibility. The integrators, the platforms, like the GitHubs, the GitLabs of the world, they got to keep their, they have to remain updated. But what's the impetus on the service providers? What is it? What's their requirement?
I would say that one place that I see that most of the service providers are kind of struggling is in the audit controls. The ability for me as a user to go in and see what's happened with my account, or with accounts that I have access to, like organization accounts. The thing that's really scary about the Docker attack is that if say I'm a huge company, say I'm, I don't know, GE, and I have some developer who happens to have admin access to a few GitHub repos. If that developer's GitHub or Docker Hub account was compromised and they had an access token attached to it, that access token gives them access to privileged repositories in GE. So I think the onus is on GitHub to provide better access controls, better audit controls for me to go in and verify what's going on, better ways for me to police it. Right. Because I don't think it's reasonable for us to ask these service providers to police it for us.
Yeah.
There's some amount of policing that they can do, but at the end of the day, it is our account.
Right.
And what happens with our account should be, at least to some degree, in our purview. There are certain things that they could obviously flag and know are probably suspicious. Like,
is that the kill button though? I mean, they have the kill button, right? I mean, they can basically, when the hack came, they were able to essentially hit the kill button and reset.
Yeah, to Docker's credit, I think they did really, really well with this attack. They communicated it very clearly, and they've pushed out communication since that has all been very clear and open. And I think that's really important. There's been a lot of companies.
That's a short-term thing, though.
Yeah,
that's great.
Handling the attack.
Yeah. But the long term, the
long term is, I think, what we need to hear more about is what's the plan to help mitigate this type of attack in the future.
Yeah.
And I think that other companies who have maybe not similar services but similarly public-facing services should be looking at this attack and thinking, how could this attack happen to me? Mm-hmm. And what would I do in Docker's shoes?
Right.
How would I manage this?
I think there's a corollary piece off something he said earlier, and that is that all of the cloud providers, as they provide more services and as they provide more functionality, it becomes more obfuscated to be able to see what you have available and what services you're even taking advantage of. If I log into the AWS portal and say, okay, what am I using here? Let me go through.
What's costing me money right this second?
Let's go through 100 different services and one by one figure out which pieces I'm using and how I'm implementing them. I think something, whether it's reactionary to attacks or whether it's something that is more of field guide for the end users, for the businesses that are consuming those services, is something that's going to need to start to be picking up, so that you can say, look, if something happens, I need to check here, 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 and here.
Yeah.
And that might be 3 different heres, or that might be 100 different heres.
Right.
But being able to say, look, if something goes wrong, these are all the places where things can go wrong. And for something that's extensive for the major cloud providers, that might be a full day class, but it might also just be, here's a sheet, here's a handout to be able to know these are the places that you need to check because these are the most compromisable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a chain of influence, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the core of open source, a chain of influence, right? Yeah, and so that, the posturing is a fascinating topic to explore, and one that I'm interested in talking about, because it does then get to the kind of the heart of the issue in many ways. Because it's like, what is the posture of the of the companies who are managing people's source code, right? The GitHubs of the world, right? What's the posture on any kind of levels for a Google, right? Google, I think, is the fastest thing about Google and AWS and Microsoft is like they're the most secure ones of all, because they're building their own tools in the first place, right? And they're able to build it from the ground up, right? So I'm curious on what the requirements would be on a major Google company like Google Cloud. I think it speaks to what you were just talking about, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think there's also a factor of where does the onus lie if something happens. As we take all these services and we take all these various cloud providers and we start to bridge them all together and say you're using GitHub and you're using Docker Hub and you're deploying your images to GKE and something goes wrong, at what point were you at fault? At what point was GitHub at fault? At what point was Docker at fault? And at what point did GKE have a problem? Is there a mechanism to be able to say, oh, if something changed, you should have done X, Y, and Z, or the stock market has a hard cutoff switch. Why can't the cloud providers?
So what's your guys' posture? What's your responsibility then?
I think our responsibility as a consultancy is primarily to provide best practices and to sort of help get those, help get those one-pagers out, get that, hey, by the way, you didn't think of A, B, and C, but you also didn't think of these 12 other things that you didn't even realize weren't on your radar.
There's a lot there. Well, I want to thank you both for taking some time to talk. It's actually really interesting to talk with you both about, these emerging technologies that are becoming more mainstream, and how that mainstream adoption is going to really, determine how healthy the community really is, right?
It really is.
And so how these postures evolve will be the big test. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Alex.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.